Hello.
Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Yes, I'm kicking off the show this week. So welcome to Better Conversations, everyone. It's 1 p.m. GMT. We'll go through all the other times in just a second. I'm co-hosting with my friend and colleague, Sehaam Cyrene. Say hello, Sehaam.
Hello.
And this week it's part two. It's part two of our three-part series,
Part two.
right?
Yes, it is.
And this week we are going to be discussing HR or recruitment. Who do you hire first? And I think we're targeting this more at the startup scale-up space, right? So just to be clear, we won't really be focusing on kind of large-scale corporates. This is more for the startup scale-up space.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, clearly, I think a few individuals might feel that I'm slightly biased when it comes to this particular question, but I'm not. Trust me. I'm taking a very balanced view on this, but we'll see what conclusions we draw as we go through the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And if you've got any questions for Glenn or myself, or you've got a different point of view and you're watching us live, do drop your comments and questions in the discussion. And if you're watching the replay, equally do the same. You'll find them all below. So we're here Tuesdays, 1 p.m. We are live streaming on, you can find us betterconversations.live, but also YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Do you want to do that?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'm up for this week. I'm ready for it, Sehaam.
Go for it.
8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2 p.m. Central European Time, 5:30 p.m. India Standard Time, and then 10 p.m. Is that Australia Eastern Standard Time?
Wow. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, cool.
Yes.
So welcome to everybody that's joining us.
Nighttime watching for us. So yeah, so this is, as Glenn said, this is part two of our series on course correcting the C-suite on talent. Potentially there's a risk here that we set off some fireworks, Glenn, but I think from what you're saying in the chat that we had earlier, I think this is going to be a pretty balanced view, certainly from a personal experience, your experience, and from my experience. So I'm sure there'll be other perspectives as well, which will be great to hear, because I think the more that we can dissect this, the more that leaders, C-suite members can make the right decisions for their startup, scale up, and so on.
100%.
So where should we start with this, Glenn?
Well, I want to start with my poll that I ran this morning on LinkedIn.
Yes.
And thank you to the 32 individuals that voted. Very much appreciated. And for all of those individuals that kind of reacted, liked, shared, and commented. I think certainly Luke's comment on this being not as straightforward and slightly nuanced is something we're going to kind of get into. But just as a result, so 32 votes. I mean, that's probably the most I've had for a poll on LinkedIn, to be fair. So I'm quite proud of that.
In a short space of time. Yep.
Yeah, a short space of time. Yeah. I just simply asked the question, which position would you hire first for a startup with between 5 to 20 employees? And the majority, 69%, said recruitment, 31% HR. And I thought, actually, I was surprised by that. I thought it might be a little bit more kind of 50-50. I didn't think it would be as distinct. So yeah, that was an interesting kind of just kind of snapshot. Admittedly, we have to take into context 32 people, okay, but at the same token, it's it kind of sets up this conversation quite nicely, because clearly, recruitment seems to be perhaps the lead hire, should we say, when you're thinking about kind of startups. What your thoughts on that poll are? Were you slightly surprised, Sehaam, or not?
No, I think that split it was 60-40, right? Roughly 60.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, 69% to 31%, as it were.
All right, okay, so 70-30, let's say. I think that kind of echoes a lot of what we were talking about. And obviously that allows for the fact that every organization is distinct, right? They'll have different pressures, different growth speeds. And so that I'm sure plays into, you know, people's positioning on it. But let's get into it, because it seems to be, you did some research, you read up some points of view out there about what's the sort of perfect or the range of how many employees you have. At what point do you get an HR person? What did you uncover?
So, and always like to kind of credit my sources, because I think it's important to give people a kind of hat tip when you kind of look at their work. So there was a blog post by the HRIS provider, Charlie HR, a chap called Harry Robertson, and I think he outlined the kind of stages of growth and when you would expect to kind of engage HR and what kind of model that would be. And he outlined that, 1 to 10 team members, typically they find that HR is outsourced. So you kind of buy in the time and specific expertise that you need. There's not really a requirement for a HR person then. And typically what you're focusing on is starting to, create the foundations for your employee handbook. So you're looking at health and safety policy, your kind of almost disciplinary dismissal process. So, linking in lightly to the kind of performance management piece. And then quite interestingly put a grievance policy in there as well. So I think it's more about starting to lay those foundations from a HR perspective, so that there's that kind of transparency. And then he went on to say 11 to 40 employees is typically when you start to look at a dedicated HR person, because performance reviews become more of an important focus area. And you want to sort of really start thinking more broadly about that onboarding, compensation and benefits as that particular company scales. But the one piece that I did note in the blog post that kind of Harry mentioned, he said that sometimes the dedicated HR person may not have formal qualifications. I was like, that's interesting. But we can possibly explore that. That was a kind of a HR perspective, which I think rings true in my experience. Typically when I join startups, it's around that kind of 30 employees that I then have to be tasked with hiring a HR person.
Well, look, there's a lot in that, Glenn, and I think there's certainly that echoes what I've seen, is that you can get to a certain size. You do have to have some basic things in place. That doesn't mean that at an early stage that you need a full-time, or that you have a requirement for a full-time person covering HR. But it's the what I find interesting is the legal documents that they're talking about, including the employee handbook, are basically, it's the contract. It's the extension of the employment contract that says this is how things are going to work, and when things go wrong, this is how we're going to remedy them. And those are the things that I think are really important to get clear about. But there is still a massive responsibility on those leaders, those founders, setting it up to you can have all of that stuff written down, but if you're not playing by the book, so to speak, it's that, those policy documents have very little value, because people are watching you and how you behave and take their cue from you, even if it says something different in the policy employee handbook, right?
And I think, to your point around leaders, right, this typically falls into the realm of the chief operations officer. So the COO is on point for this type of thing, because it's contract related, and obviously, whether that's kind of contracts for the clients that they're dealing with, but equally contracts for the employees they're bringing on board. So the COO, I think, usually takes ownership of this type of activity, contract of employment, and perhaps starts to create the foundations of that employee handbook. I think it's interesting for me that actually this particular blog post kind of echoes my experience to date. But equally, if any individuals have experienced the complete opposite or something contrary to that, we'd be happy to hear from them in the comments. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just to the roles within a startup of who takes on that responsibility. It is typically the chief operating officer, the COO, or it might be, you mentioned earlier, the office manager, if you have an office manager who kind of has a catch-all thing, list of functions and so on that they perform. And then you've also, I think, as companies progress, there's a leaning towards having a chief of staff who may take on some of that, or may cover for if you've got a gap in an HR person coming on board. But we had a discussion about, because there's a lot of people that come in into a startup who are head of people. And this has been a trend, certainly I've seen over the past few years. They have no formal HR qualifications, right? So they're coming in and their remit can be sort of more around culture and other aspects of people that don't require necessarily training, or where maybe the training is a little, actually, I might be getting into hot water here, but there are some elements of HR training that I think are sometimes behind the curve. And diversity may be an example of that, and how you actually make that happen, because the reality is we've all struggled, all companies are struggling to make that happen. So let's be honest about the fact that everyone's experimenting and trying to find a way to do it, and I don't think we've solved that one yet by any stretch. And so for a startup, is it more about culture? Is it more about performance? Where do you think that's it?
Oh yeah, trying to unpack that. And I think you just let off firework number one there, by the way. But you're right. I think when you think about heads of people, there are kind of two routes that I've seen. Either individuals come through the HR route to head of people, or they come through the talent acquisition, head of talent route into head of people. I think when you get into that head of people space, absolutely, culture is one of the key things that I think that the C-suite and the leaders want you to focus on, and really kind of defining what that culture looks like, and then implementing activities and action policies to really continue to promote and support that culture. I think in terms of, I guess, circling back on performance and that piece, so ultimately, for either HR or talent acquisition to define what and put a framework in place as to what a great performance looks like, you need the input of line managers, right? You need the leadership to kind of define what does great performance look like in the context of their business, and therein, how would they measure that from a kind of metric perspective? And that's for me, I mean, starting to even put in a kind of foundational element of performance, you do need to consult with the business to get their input, right? There's no kind of, well, I mean, there are, but I wouldn't suggest a kind of almost off-the-shelf performance management or performance assessment, kind of framework. You need to think about what that means for your business. Now, therein, actually, is perhaps a process or a workshop to help the business actually think about performance, then start to define it. Otherwise, the danger is you jump in with some probably historic or traditional KPIs and metrics that you're measuring people against, which might not actually be fit for purpose for your business. It's the easiest option.
Absolutely.
So say, for instance, in a sales position, you're like, okay, X percentage of revenue determines, a great outcome, etc. Well, that may be relevant if you've got quite a mature pre-existing product or service. But if you're just starting out as a business selling your product or service, do you think that those particular metrics are fair? And are there other things that, kind of performance could be measured by? So I think, that performance framework can be implemented by either HR or supported by kind of a recruitment flavored head of people. But it starts with the business understanding what great performance looks like.
Right. And I think this is kind of one of the important foundations of your culture is you can't take something off the shelf and just say, this is what we want. And you also have to watch that any work that you do that defines your mission, your core values, and so on, doesn't end up being very bland and not relatable at all. And so it has to be fit for purpose. It has to fit your organization and the culture that you're doing, your stakeholders. Has to be relevant. And yeah, you're right. That stuff can be put in. You could have someone come in and deliver that piece. I've done that with some startups, have gone in and supported them with getting a performance framework, actually defining what are the behaviors and values you actually want people to exhibit and therefore be able to measure them on tangibly. But that's part of a whole bigger piece around your culture. And at some point you do grow to that size where you need a full-time HR person. Yeah.
So, yeah, it is. And I think it feeds in neatly to part 3 of our kind of series for next week in terms of the kind of recruitment workflow, which we'll definitely circle back on. I read another kind of article before coming on for this chat, and a chap called Matthias Klenk, who's a co-founder of Parspace. He wrote a really interesting piece around, okay, when you start to recruit, from not from a volume perspective, but when you start to found a business, you're typically, you can go into your network or your investors network to start hiring in those individuals. But when you start to think about hiring 5, 7, 10 people at a time, you then probably have exhausted your kind of network, your kind of VC investor network. So my question then would be, at that point when you need to, kind of recruit that level of people, do you go for recruitment or HR? I think the answer is relatively straightforward, right? I don't know many HR people that, they can, but I don't think they would see kind of recruitment as part of their remit. So if you've just landed a nice chunk of kind of funding, and you now have to scale very quickly and start hiring at that point, and that comes into that kind of sort of 1 to 10 team members you outsource, then 11 to 40 employees you think about perhaps a dedicated HR person. Well, surely if the focus is hiring, recruitment, step forward, right? What's your thoughts?
Right. Well, I think I'm inclined to agree with you, because I think the growth is there, and certainly what I see, and the C-suite can justify having a dedicated full-time HR person when the workload becomes too much for the person who's been looking after it. So the COO, for example. But also the requests start to come in thick and fast from your employees, where they've been with you a year, 18 months, and they've worked really hard. They've delivered great stuff. And then they're starting to think, okay, so where, what's happening next? Where do we go? Is there either an opportunity for me to grow into or step up? So that might be the expansion of individuals, or actually, I want to be, I want a manager who knows how to grow me. And so what does that look like? And I think that's when organizations, when that sort of pressure becomes too much, they say, right, we need someone full-time to come in and put in a structure for us, get all the documentation written, course correct us on any things where we've gone wrong. That's the sort of realistic picture on the ground, right? The ideal one is that you can start with something and crack on and everything's in place from day one, but that doesn't work like that.
I think, what about an alternative option to purely HR in terms of that kind of coaching your team, when you actually, you actively seek perhaps, kind of leadership coaching that allows you to then start thinking about coaching your teams and putting a framework in place? Do you need a HR person to do that? Is the HR person there to just kind of underpin the framework once it's been defined, or can they deliver that for you?
It's a deliver the leadership training.
Well, yeah, because ultimately if you're sort of saying, okay, the say a collection of the kind of line managers recognize that they need leadership training. They want to, kind of really understand what it means to kind of scale a team. It's, for some of them, it's the first time they've led a team. So they're being intentional around getting coaching to kind of allow them to do that. Is that sufficient enough? So that kind of approach, getting leadership coaching to help them, kind of benefit their team members, or are we saying you definitely need HR as part of that conversation?
No, I think it depends on the skill set, like anything, right? You might have, in the same way, you might have a COO who's got a bit of HR experience or some background. That's a value add, or they might enjoy that, right? So from a best use of skills across the board of what you have, that's a question that you've got to figure out. Am I the best person to do it, or do we need someone who can do it better? Same for if you're bringing someone, an HR person in to deliver the leadership stuff. I think that can be trickier in reality to make that happen. And I would say, here's a twist in the plot for you. Yeah. I personally think that perhaps not in a full-time capacity, but scale-up teams, the sort of founding team, should have access to an in-house or access to a coach from the very beginning, because you are dealing with people and you're trying to balance enormous pressure around workloads, hitting target strategies, delivering on stuff for your investors, and you are trying to grow people and delegate and do all that side of things. So they are super time poor. But that's not the discussion here. That's a different discussion.
Well,
I think
it kind of feeds into the thinking, though, doesn't it? Around kind of who you hire first, HR or recruitment, right? So when you're thinking about, your business scaling, you're starting to think about what's the hires you need, both in terms of what I would class as a kind of either product focus or what you need in terms of a kind of people focus. And I think when you know this better than I do, because you're speaking to, kind of founders and co-founders quite regularly, right? When you get that chunk of kind of cash from your fundraise, right? And that VC, that new boarder, right? You need to hire quality people now. You need to start scaling. You need to get salespeople in. You need to get more product people in. You need to get designers in, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
In that mindset, your first thought is, we need to recruit. And, ultimately, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that's therein where, perhaps the kind of utilization of recruitment agencies start with is just like, oh, look, they'll start feeding a kind of pipeline of people in. But in actual fact, that's what they will do is, they'll send you a lot of kind of CVs, but actually they won't create any kind of experience for those individuals being introduced to your business. That first touch point is super important when you're in you're in a competitive market like we are at the moment. You have no employer or talent brand awareness at all. So the first touch point for individuals is the recruitment agency. Is that really what you want their first experience to be? And now I'm not discrediting recruitment agencies, because there are agencies out there who are exceptionally good at being brand advocates, but I wouldn't say that's, that's consistent across the piece. Then in that mindset, does HR become very much a secondary thing and stay within the remit of the office manager and the COO?
That certainly makes sense for people in the C-suite or the founders. There is definitely a strong leaning towards that. I think that I'm aligned to you. I think recruitment, having someone who is part of the fabric of your culture and your business and can see what's going on day to day and what people are trying to build, and has an understanding of the personalities and the passions and so on of the people, is really key. Now, if that means you're better off having that person, that recruitment person, as part of your team, whether it's 100%, 50%, whatever you need, then I think that's a smart way to go, because as you say, you're building an experience, you're bringing people in, and there's still a lot of strong emotional attachment usually from the founders towards who's in their team. And so there's you've got to be able to be that personality in recruitment who can help leaders navigate and make the right decisions about who's coming onto the team with a longer term view. And then, yeah, I think at a later stage, getting a trained HR person to hold that function and also sit at the decision-making table, because very often people bring in HR and they're not invited into the senior leadership team powwows. And I think that's a mistake. You need someone who can be in those meetings and is making strategic people decisions. So, and that's what I often see, is that there's HR isn't seen as a party to that, and that's a mistake.
Agreed. I'm flipping this completely on its head. If you think about, yeah, exactly. If you, well, from my perspective, right, everybody knows I come from a recruitment background, but recruitment is that there's no educational benchmark entry for recruitment, right? Whereas certainly when you think about HR, there is, you know, the CIPD qualification, which gives businesses assurance that they're, as you said earlier, the quality assurance that comes with that accreditation gives businesses confidence that that individual has an understanding of frameworks, policies, how to implement that, how to, you know, kind of deal and manage with some of the more kind of challenging parts of kind of people management, whether it be kind of, you know, kind of underperformance reviews, you know, kind of even at the worst case scenario, kind of, you know, employment contract terminations. Whereas recruiters, like I said, no educational benchmark that I'm aware of to get into recruitment. So what quality assurance do you get when you hire an in-house recruiter? I mean, what are you measuring that person on? The strength of their network? Well, I mean, they could have an exceptional network, but they could be an absolute nightmare when it comes to policy, employment law, all of these things. Yeah. So in that mindset, if you're you know, thinking and you're approaching this in terms of a very kind of risk averse way, HR would make more sense than recruitment, right? Surely you'd hire the HR person to then screen the recruitment person. Just a thought.
Well, I think again it comes down to the skill set of the individuals, right? You want, if you're going to get a recruitment person, you want them to know their legals. You want them to know the impact of things like IR35, right to work, all of those things, right?
Yeah.
That as leaders or founders of a company, you've got no idea about, let's face it. I mean, that's a reality. Why would you need to know that stuff? But as a recruiter, you should know that. You should be aware of that. And I think the other thing is that you're dealing with really strong personalities often. People who see themselves as custodians or protectors of their brand or their product, what they've set up. And as an individual, as the recruiter in the room helping, you know, them decide who to recruit, you've got to have a fantastic skill set in terms of conversation, being able to navigate, being able to influence, being able to challenge you know, the decisions that are being made. When you see that that's quite a biased point of view, or you know, that's a very subjective opinion that you've got about someone, how do you back that up to the points that you talk about a lot, right?
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I think when it comes to kind of recruitment, I would say genuinely most, and I completely understand why this would happen, right? When, you know, kind of people think about hiring a recruiter, they just think, well, you know, recruiter is a recruiter. They find CVs, that kind of thing. But there is a distinct difference in terms of, you know, the different kind of levels of experience. So if you just want somebody to find you kind of CVs, typically that's a sourcer. That's somebody that just goes to market, sources candidates based on your kind of job requirements, and then presents them to you. There'll be some obviously pre-qualification there, but then you move to what I call as a 360 kind of recruiter. There's somebody that can understand a lot more of, you know, the kind of sourcing, implement, you know, kind of assessment frameworks, interview frameworks, underpin that with scorecards, and manage that particular individual from first contact all the way through to offer, close, and onboarding. So I think that there is perhaps an education piece there for some kind of founders, co-founders, that when you think about recruitment, you do need to think about the kind of type of recruiter that you want, because that leans into how much time the business are going to then need to lean into that recruitment process to kind of support it and guide it. So yeah, and to your point around, I would expect a baseline of understanding of any recruiter just in terms of kind of right to work, employment law, and the factors that could impact a hire, because that would inform their initial kind of pre-screening interview.
Right. And the experience that they are getting, right? The experience that they're getting, to what we talked about last week about your brand, the employer brand, talent brand, and the effect that has. So for sure, I think it comes down to look at either be very clear about the skills that you need for where your business is at, and what you need for it to take you from 11 people to 40 people, say. And equally, on the HR side, I think you also need to know what is it that we need, because maybe what you've got is sufficient. Maybe you've got a very basic employee manual, you've got good contracts in place, which have been legally vetted, and you've got the process accurate as to how you handle performance, for example, or what an employee can do if they've got a problem. So if you've got people who've got great skills in that, then as the COO, for example, who's holding the HR responsibility, then I think recruitment is the best call you can make to get you to grow you to that place, and then think about handing that over to somebody who is trained and specialized in HR. Yeah,
for sure. I think just circling back on your point around culture, which we touched upon earlier, I think if you're thinking about embedding a kind of a framework for that culture, I would lean towards HR in that scenario, simply because policies, frameworks, etc., can underpin a culture, right? They're more tangible things as opposed to just maybe articulating the values. And I think recruitment can inform and input into and be an advocate for taking that message to market. But I would if that's one of the sort of key focuses for your business as it grows, I would certainly look to HR to support that and kind of document that. But that there again, it kind of leads into that route to head of people. Is somebody coming very much from a HR perspective, or are they coming from a recruitment perspective? And if I'm honest, in that, I don't have a kind of a strong argument either way. I think it's really about the outputs of that individual in that post. I've seen exceptional heads of people come from both routes, and be very and have a massive impact on kind of businesses. So yeah, like I say, it's my leaning when you think about that is possibly towards HR. But I think when you think about head of people, I'm on the fence in that respect. I don't know what your thoughts. I mean, look, you've set up, scaled, and ran your own businesses before, and we were talking about this pre-show, and you kind of brought HR in about the sort of same time as we've been discussing, around that kind of circa 40 employees kind of mark. And I was interested to understand, what were the factors that led to you bringing that HR person in? What were you considering?
Yeah. Actually, I have to correct you. I didn't ever bring in an HR person. Oh, okay. That was I just enjoyed. It was an element that I enjoyed that side of the business, and so I wore lots of hats, and I I put a lot of effort into the employee handbook and getting that right. I was really focused on making sure that people had the training and support that they needed. If ever I was unsure, I would reach out to legal counsel to vet and check any agreements or processes and so on. And it was only later that I sort of formalized the experience that I had through HR certification in the States, actually. And so I think it really, that's what I mean. It depends on the interest and the skill of the people that you have in your founding team. If there's someone that can do that and is genuinely interested in that. I think, if I was to run what I did again, would I do it differently? Probably not on that, but I would definitely have the recruitment was something that I think in hindsight I would have brought someone in specially to just focus on that, because operationally that is so key to have the right people at the right time without burning your team to deliver. And also, there are times as a small business where you grow and then you have to shrink, right? Market factors mean you're in those difficult spots, and at those times you really need some HR support. So that's on the other side of it. But for sure, recruitment, and if I'd had a coach, that would have been awesome. I think that would have meant that I would have made smarter decisions faster. So look, a lot of this, I think, for founding members in a startup is worrying about everything, right? What can go wrong? Have I made the right decision? I haven't had time to really think about this. I think one of the hardest things is bringing new people into your team. It is such an emotional roller coaster, and that's why I think a really great recruiter is a smart move for a startup, because you want someone to give you an objective perspective and challenge your thinking about, is this the right person for our business? And we haven't even touched on sort of diversity factors and our biases and so on. You have so much going on in your head as a leader that this massive part about who you bring into your ecosystem is so personal, so emotionally charged. And from that perspective, I'd say recruitment is on the money. And I would outsource HR as and when I needed it, until I got to the size where my people really want me to have some structure in place for their growth and development. And that would be the other, that would be the sort of marker.
Brilliant. Well, that was even better than I anticipated, because you just illustrated the fact that you didn't need HR at all, and you actually assumed that, and it was something that you kind of took forward yourself. So yeah, win-win. I mean, I think I think for me as well, and if we come back to that point around the kind of first contact, if you're a kind of startup and a scale up, unless the individuals you're looking to hire in some way, shape or form are also perhaps the consumer of your product or service, which is likely to a degree sometimes, kind of fintech space, insurtech space, I mean, perhaps, certainly retail space, they may not have even heard of your company, that this is the individual that's being contacted, right? So you're not just thinking about, to your point, you're not just thinking about somebody that can identify an individual that fits a job requirement and then ultimately contact them, present that job requirement, confirm their interest, and then present that back to the hiring manager. Actually, and certainly in the market that we're in at the moment, which is massively competitive, you need somebody that can sell, negotiate, and actually tell the story of what your business is about and identify the value proposition. Now, ultimately, if you're a startup, you may have no employee value proposition. And as we discussed before, no employer brand, no talent brand, no employee value proposition. So if you're just presenting a job spec, unless that's an exceptionally well written job spec or very, very witty, it's unlikely to make the impact that perhaps you want. So then you're reliant on that individual that you've hired in that kind of recruitment role to really go beyond and be able to articulate and be a brand advocate and ambassador for your business. So then beyond the kind of measurement of can they recruit, there is a whole other tier around can they sell, negotiate, advocate for your business? Can they tell a story? And how can co-founders, founders assess that? I mean, because it's it's kind of a different complete metric or a different frame of reference for them when you think about traditional recruitment.
Yeah.
And I just wonder where what your thoughts might be around that.
Well, as you say all of that, Glenn, what comes to mind is experience. It's like your recruiter needs to have been and seen a few of these play out to understand the importance or significance of getting a particular thing right in the process. Yeah. And I think that comes with experience, unless you're an incredibly curious individual, which there aren't many folk like that. I think that's a unique skill, but I think it comes down to having the experience, right? Because we're so and also I kind of want to come back to something that you said at the very beginning in one of the resources that you referenced, which was once you've recruited from your initial circle of friends and so on, that's a challenging place to be if you want to be seen as a diverse employer, right? Or a company that's diverse. That's problematic in itself. And so if you continue down that road of recruiting from your friends' friends and so on, you ain't going to get much diversity in your organization. And that is a tougher thing to work back from and fix. And so I think for that reason, yes, all of the things that you said are really important. And that ability to guide leaders and flag when there's some bias at play that's unhelpful to them and is not actually where they would like to go. Someone to remind you that we could do that, but is that a fair question to ask? Is that a fair way to assess this individual against that individual? So I think I think all of those are incredibly important. Your conversation skills, you've got to be diplomatic. These are often there's a lot of emotional triggers here, so you have to be able to navigate that. And I think experience and great skill are two things you want to be looking for in a recruiter.
Definitely. And we come into that they come into that frame of reference as soft skills, right? So conversational skills, intellectual
hard
curiosity.
Skills, I like to tell them. Yeah.
Oh, well, hard skills. Yeah, even.
They are hard.
They're hard skills. Hard skills. Yeah. Hence why I did the quotes, because I wasn't quite sure if it's soft or, but it's kind of the sort of things that perhaps aren't immediately easy to kind of quantify if you're early in your understanding of recruiting and recruitment. And I would challenge any startup or scale up to not, to if they said they hadn't had a bad hire. Every business has had a bad hire. Some have had more than one, because they've been indexing very much on the subjective as opposed to objective assessment. Now, they can't be blamed for that, because ultimately, that framework's not in place. But a good recruiter should be able to take you from that place of subjectivity to objectivity, which is something that is supported by HR, because ultimately your point around unconscious bias, policies in place and training in place to help the kind of hiring team and leaders to kind of be aware of that. But equally, that can start with recruitment in terms of, okay, this is your current interview process, and these are all the things that we could look to add to that to make it a very fair, very inclusive and engaging process. And this is, again, my point around when you hire that kind of first in-house recruiter, you need to be thinking intentionally about, can this individual do this? Can they start to implement this? Otherwise, they are just sending CVs, and sending CVs is not going to add anything to your culture. It's not going to add any, it's not going to add any value. So, kind of whilst engaging agencies is a very quick route, an expensive route to kind of start generating, as everybody calls it, a candidate pipeline, it may not actually ultimately really be delivering the value that you need as you're starting to build and scale.
Right.
So again, my thinking kind of swings back to perhaps the recruiter is the first hire you need to make, and then complemented by kind of HR at some point when you're at a scale where those kind of policies need to be implemented.
Yeah, I think we're aligned on this, Glenn, which may be unhelpful to those who wanted a different perspective on that.
yeah. I think great HR people massively add value to any business, and I've worked with some fantastic HR professionals that really are, to that firework that you set off earlier, in terms of how progressive are HR reactionary, or are they progressive? I've been lucky enough to work with some very progressive HR individuals that are more business and people orientated than perhaps policy focused. But I know that that may not be the experience of every business. And I think when you're thinking about that kind of first hire, put the people at the center of that. What do you think your people need right now? And that's both the people that you want to hire, but equally the people in your existing business. And that should help shape your decision making. But yeah, I mean, you're right.
Well, I think that's a good point, because they are making a contribution, and they're growing the team, and these are people you're going to be working with. So what do your people want?
It's kind of like, sorry, just to say, it's kind of like, okay, do they need certain policies that you can outsource and get done, kind of via an outsourced HR provider? And actually, the more important thing is hiring new team members, because actually, from a bandwidth perspective, they're completely 100%. Now, in that kind of scenario, if you gave that person in the team an option, do you want a policy around kind of, like you say, kind of dismissal policy, or do you want a new team member to help you kind of deliver this particular release? I think they go, hire me somebody to work with to help me deliver that outcome.
Right. And look, it's always a balance. And this is people talk about startups and scale-ups being scrappy. They are scrappy because you're being pulled in opposite directions a lot of the time. And yes, you need a problem solved now, but you also want that recruiter to have a view of the longer term. And the skills that you hire in the next 6 months may be different to the skills that you need in the following 6 months, right? Depending on where you get to as a size. And a good recruiter will understand that. And it's at that point that you kind of go, okay, we need to go from here to there. We've got people with this skill set who are good and responsive and great with ambiguity, but maybe less great on the detail and staying, in a focused area. And so how do you bring that together, both sort of operationally and, culture wise within the organization? So is there anything else that we haven't sort of touched on this aspect?
I think we kind of both agreed we wanted to come to a point where we were making a statement. Now, I have kind of full respect for the HR friends in my network, but I do think that when the real key emphasis and pressure is to hire, securing that kind of 360 recruiter is going to be a key priority. And if you can continue to kind of draw in, kind of HR guidance, and, perhaps the office manager and COO, continue to sort of take that kind of interim kind of lead role in that, I think that would be my initial thinking. That's been my experience today. Let's put it that way. But that's not to say that I don't fully acknowledge the massive value that HR can bring to a business. That's for sure.
Oh, and look, an HR person who can translate between strategic and business speak and people speak, and can make the case to their peers who should be that C-suite. If you're bringing an HR person in, they should be sitting in your leadership team, not, but then again, there are reasons for that. There's budget and so on. But I think that's potentially a strategic mistake that we make over and over again in organizations, is not having HR at the table for a lot
agreed.
of longer term decisions, right?
Definitely. Don't bring HR in and sit them in the corner and just allow them to, or want them to react to things. HR needs to immediately be sitting at the leadership table, discussing the kind of strategic objectives of the business and how that aligns to and could impact the people in it. 100%.
Yeah. But until then, it's recruitment. That's what we say.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think a lot of people are just going to be like, wow, that's a surprising conclusion. but I think I would caveat and say that, it's not just bringing in a recruiter, it's bringing in a certain kind of a recruiter with a certain level of understanding of that type of space, that startup scale up space. Otherwise, it could actually, in fairness, without that experience, it could actually be more detrimental than an actual positive. You know what I mean? And could be more detrimental in terms of the brand. I mean, it could be seriously detrimental.
Absolutely. Now, that's a perfect segue, because that's the kind of stuff that you cover in your course, Glenn. Is that not correct?
Oh, that is indeed, yeah. I mean, it feels like a bit of a cheeky plug, really, doesn't it? But I do. Well, I mean, I wouldn't.
It's a fair plug.
Yeah. I mean, you encouraged me to really kind of think about writing this, and I think the more I kind of thought about it, I thought actually it can be valuable, because if you're empowering the kind of leadership team right from the off and giving them that kind of understanding of the sort of typical perhaps pitfalls and things that they need to kind of consider at that very early stage, if they knew that from the off, my thinking is, how much better will that be for the people coming into a business, and actually how much better that would be for perhaps some of the people that are already in the business. So I think it's almost like I'm writing a course to put myself out of a job, basically.
No, well, I think what it comes down to is it's a partnership between leaders in the organization and a really great recruiter and HR, right? So it has merit throughout that journey, because I work with companies, as you do, who may be 5 people, they might be 120, 300 people, and this recruitment is one of the toughest toughest areas, and I get asked all the time, what do we do? How do we have better conversations in this space around recruitment, so that my team can do more, so that we can fly faster. Definitely worth checking out the course, Talent for Leaders.
Yeah, and joking aside, look, I mean, I would want to educate businesses on what can be achieved by recruitment, so thereby almost holding kind of recruitment to a higher standard of expectation. And I think that's important. I know as a community, we do look to, kind of share knowledge and really look to, kind of increase the standards within recruitment as a whole. So Talent for Leaders is definitely a continuation of that ethos.
No, for sure. You've got a lot to give there, Glenn. There's a lot that's very rich in that journey that you take people through. So definitely do check that out. So next week is part 3. What are we covering next week?
Well, I think we quite simply called it delivering an amazing candidate experience. I think that in itself, what does that mean? So it comes back to that point around the kind of 360 recruiter, somebody that you kind of hire that can take that individual from that first contact all the way through to offer, close, onboarding. So the recruitment, kind of workflow that underpins that, and then the experience that actually is layered on top of that. And that's what we're going to go through. We're going to kind of break that down and kind of discuss that a little bit more, because ultimately, if individuals are just thinking recruitment is get CV, send to hiring manager interviews, and then we're good to go, that is not a candidate experience. That is not a candidate experience. And we want individuals to have an amazing kind of experience when they have chosen to either apply for a role at your business, and or you've contacted them and they're like, okay, yeah, I'm interested, tell me more. So there needs to be an experience that they go through that results in a positive outcome for both.
Yeah. Long-term, strategic, intentional.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Brand advocacy,
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Well, Glenn, that time flew as always. I'm following your lead with these AirPods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
For me, if I laugh too much, they pop out. Any tips on that?
No, I mean, you've got small, delicate ears, Sehaam. I've got massive ears, so there's no chance these are coming out at all. No chance.
Damn, I got no tip there. Well, if you've got any suggestions, folks, helping me with my AirPods not popping out, that would be great. Yeah. But seriously, thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching this, and we'll see you next week. And if you're watching the replay, part 3 will pop up somewhere on the screen, but for sure the links will be in the description. So if you've got any questions, I know you've got a question from Debbie Easterday waiting for you, Glenn. I think that's probably one for you to answer offline.
Debbie's awesome. Yeah, thanks, Debbie.
Yeah, cool. All right. So we're here on Tuesday next week at 1 p.m. UK time. So come and find us.
Come and find us in. Thank you, Sehaam.
Yeah. All right. Cheers, Glenn.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.